During the presentations, we would like to ask the other participants who are not our invited speakers to please mute yourself and switch off your cameras, just to allow that everyone has the best opportunity to follow the presentations. And also, we would like to ask you to please add any questions or comments regarding the presentations or just the topic in general by using the Slido application. My colleague Boldizsár will insert a link in the chat so that you can all access the Slido and post your questions there. And once we listen to all the 3 presentations, we will use the Slido, and I will just read the questions which we received through the Slido according to their priority. And that is the way how we will organize the discussion to be as effective as we can. So I think that this is mostly all the technical details I wanted to share. And now we can already start the main food for thought, sharing the main food for thought for you today. Our first invited speaker is Esther Turnhout. She is the Chair of Science, Technology and Society at the University of Twente, Netherlands. And she was also participating in the EBES Global Assessment and now in the EBES Transformative Change Assessment. So Esther has both an internal and an external viewpoint on science policy interfaces. Esther, the floor is yours.
Okay, so can everybody see my screen now? And this is supposedly full screen view, right? Okay.
Yes, it's perfect.
So, so thank you very much for organizing, and thank you very much for having me here. I have quite a few slides to get through, but I think I'll be making quite a simple point here. Because I'll be talking about the need to transform environmental science. And I will also argue that this sort of broad recognition of the need to transform science is really not very new. So increasingly in my career, I start to ask the question, if we seem to all agree that this is needed, why aren't we doing it? And what are the actual obstacles that prevent us from taking further steps? And I already, as a caveat, I won't be giving definite answers here, but just some tentative thinking on our part on why this might be the case, but also to discuss especially with this community, because this is a community that is interested in these very questions and also has quite a bit of experience that I also, from my own personal interest, would like to learn from. So more of a discussion starter than definite scientific facts, I would say. So there is this wide agreement that science policy and society should engage in order for science to have any sort of impact. So whether to engage or not to engage is really no longer a question, particularly in environmental fields. But the important question here is how to engage. So just to show here, Future Earth was established a while ago, has this notion of engagement and particularly co-production straight in the center of its mission. And also, and I think there's many more examples that you can find here, calls from scientists to say that we really need to change how science is done are increasingly old. And I don't think that this is the earliest incarnation of that. So we've heard this before. And we've heard this quite a bit before. So the question, why are we not making more progress? will feature a number of times in this presentation, and particularly in my collaboration with Marianne Lassen, who is at Linköping. We are starting to find some tentative answers to that question. So one first answer to that question, why we are not making more progress, is basically this. And many of you will have seen this or a similar picture before. This is what is known as the linear model, where science and society are seen as separate, and this separation is considered to be important for science to provide objective knowledge, which then is up to society to base their decisions on. This linear model has been criticized a lot, and I won't repeat those criticisms here, but it's really important to recognize that it's still quite prominent. And it can be clearly recognized, for example, in the mission statements of organizations such as IPCC, and also IPBES still adheres to this linear notion of science policy relationships. So with this notion of science as separate from policy, and with the norm of objectivity as an important driving factor, you actually see something interesting emerging, which is quite problematic, I would say. So here's Julia Steinberger making quite an important argument, saying that IPCC modeling has actually served to protect vested interests and protect fossil fuel industry. So now the IPCC has done lots of things, but this particular example of modeling negative emission technologies, which do not exist and do not actually have a high likelihood of ever being realistic at scale, cannot be seen otherwise, I would argue, than as one quite prominent example of how modeling technologies and the IPCC, under the veil of being neutral, of not being political, actually serves vested interests. A second tentative answer to the question why we are not making more progress is that this linear model is not just something that scientists seem to like a lot, but it's also demanded by policymakers. So what you really have here is a lock-in situation where in this linear model of science policy relations, policymakers ask for knowledge on how to govern the planet, and then scientists are compelled to actually buy into that framing of a singular world for science to represent and assess, and subsequently for policymakers to govern. So it's really a joint relationship here that keeps this linear model in place. Of course, we have also seen an answer to the limitations of the linear model, and I'm mentioning here specifically the example of knowledge co-production, which is known in many different fields under different names, like participatory knowledge production, action research, transdisciplinarity. All these terms are for convenience shoved under this single umbrella. This mode of knowledge production in many ways tries to solve the problems of the linear model by including participation and collaboration, by directly connecting knowledge to action, often taking place in quite place-based systems, quite local sort of situations, and connecting thereby also the knowledge of scientists, of practitioners, and of local indigenous communities. But, and this is going to be a rather quick argument and a bit unnuanced, but actually what you see in studies of co-production is that it suffers from similar problems as the linear model. Because in these processes, what you also see, similar as in the linear model, you see an apolitical framing of knowledge, an apolitical framing of knowledge-action relations, often under the assumption of consensus that needs to be created, where actually in practice in these processes, the inequalities between knowledge systems, between science, for example, and non-scientific knowledge systems, end up being reproduced. And I would also really emphasize here that while I'm being quite critical of knowledge co-production, and I think it can be improved, it is also really important to emphasize that these approaches are marginal. So as an answer to the linear model, they are really, they receive under 1% of total funding when you look at total environmental science funding. So in general, I would say social sciences, humanities, including these participatory approaches, are really not mainstream yet, even though we sometimes feel that there should be no longer a discussion about the importance of it. If you look at funding, you really see that people don't put their money where their mouth is. So thinking a little bit about the limitations of more linear model traditional forms of scientific knowledge production and the limitations of co-production approaches in practice, if you synthesize these together and then ask the question, why are we not making more progress? My answer would be actually that this is due to an underappreciation of the role of framing. And this underappreciation of the importance of framing leads to the reproduction of problematic norms of science and problematic norms for science policy society relations. And I'll briefly illustrate this argument. So first of all, framing. As we also argue in the book cover that I just showed on the previous slide, it's really important to recognize that even if you separate science from society and policy making, you still have this very simple situation that facts cannot speak for themselves. And that in order to communicate meaningfully about the results of research, you always have to frame. And in these frames, facts and values entwine. And they create a definition, if you like, of what the research problem is or what the societal problem is. And these frames then also continue to define the solution space. And they define what knowledge is seen as relevant, which then, keeping in mind the huge inequities within and between knowledge systems, it is easy to understand probably that certain frames gain dominance over others and exclusion takes place in so doing. I've also analyzed these processes before under the term of measurementality, where you actually see that fashionable concepts come in, they start to dictate how knowledge is framed. But then these frames then also structure the production of scientific knowledge, and they structure the types of policies and decisions that are being taken. So again, what you see here is this locked-in situation that much of biodiversity science, and I think this is a bit of a, I'm not sure to what extent this is really still true of ecosystem services, but that's maybe a side point. But what you see is that you really have how a dominant way of framing nature or a dominant way of framing the environment creates this lock-in situation where science, because they want to be seen as relevant, will start packaging their knowledge in these terms. Policies will be made on the basis of that, and it's like a feedback loop that becomes quite difficult to escape from. So to conclude, why are we not making more progress? Now, first of all, I would say there's quite a big role of vested interests in science, where you see that existing habits and privileges and power positions are quite hard to kick. I think this is an underappreciated point here, which we talk a little bit about in one of the papers, but was not the focus of this presentation. And then there is this lack of recognition of framing, which leads to the norm of neutrality being put into practice in a way that fails to recognize and question the frames that are dominant and taken for granted, like the quote by Julia Steinberger I showed, which then reinforces the values and interests that underlie these frames. And second, what you see very often is that the norm of good science policy society relations is often dominated by the idea of effectiveness. And we really need to recognize that in practice, what we understand to be effective science policy interfaces, and which are also the science policy interfaces people are excited about, where people feel that there's good collaborations and mutual understanding, which are all in a way fantastic things to have. But it's also because you both work, scientists and policymakers both work in a shared problem frame. And the important part here is shared singular problem frame. So effective science policy interactions are almost never diverse. Because diverse science policy interactions are often not very effective. They're difficult. They're contentious, they're in all kinds of ways quite difficult to participate in and sometimes even uncomfortable. So this is a problem because it leads to a situation in which dominant values, interests, and knowledge systems are reinforced because not questioning them is seen as neutral, while questioning them will be seen as political, which then will be beyond the mandate that scientists in science policy interfaces often have aligned with for themselves. Which then also means that the exclusion or even more tricky perhaps, the co-optation or assimilation of marginalized perspectives and knowledge systems is taken for granted. It's seen as normal and it's seen as justifiable because including them would interfere with this effectiveness. So what do we need to do? Actually, in the publications that I showed that are on the bottom of the slide, we feel that it's high time now because many years have passed until these first calls for the need to transform science have passed, and we are not making progress. And actually, what both Marianne and I experience is that in practice, the proposal to genuinely transform science gets a lot of pushback and resistance from within the scientific community. We are considering that what is really needed are some more bigger steps, actually, where the empowerment of critical social sciences and humanities approaches, including collaborative and transdisciplinary research, is really important. But we start to think that this might only be possible if we start to actively disempower dominant approaches. Because clearly they will want us in the same room as long as we are not threatening. And with under 1% of funding, this is clearly the current situation. But to equalize that playing field will require some difficult steps to take. A second one is that we would propose to remake or reinvent the science policy contract to really get away from these problematic norms of neutrality and effectiveness and recognize the politics of knowledge and the inherently political character of knowledge policy action relationships. This, we believe, requires the explicit recognition of the importance of pluralism. So not just diversity, no, but differences where there is a place for contestation and disagreement, where there is a place for these uncomfortable relationships between science, policy, and society. This, we suggest, and then I'm coming to a close, could be, comes quite close to what we have seen in literature on the decolonization of science, which has been for me personally been quite a profound source of inspiration to start thinking differently about what is actually really needed for change to happen, where we cannot have simply more of nice things, but also need to actively shut down harmful and unproductive and ineffective practices. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Esther, for this brilliant presentation. To the audience, if you have any question or comment regarding this presentation, please use the Slido link. Boldizsár already posted it in the chat. And before going to the next presentation, we have a small fun poll question to you. Boldi, could you please launch the first polling question? If everything goes well, you should be able to see this question on the screen. And building on your own experiences, just feel free to select the option which is closest to your own experience. Okay. Shall we still wait a little bit for replies?
4 of you did not vote yet.
Okay. I think we can maybe just have a look at the results now, just out of curiosity. All right.
I hope you can see it now.
Yes, it's really interesting. It's high-level policy decision makers who are the lead, then policymakers at the implementation level. And this is followed by scientists and by the other category. Really interesting. Without going into discussing these results, I now would like to invite our second speaker, Monica Berg. Monica is an associate professor at the Örebro University, Sweden, and she studied different science policy interfaces for many years now. So I think she will be able to share some exciting views also. Please, Monica, go ahead.
Thank you, Esther, and I would like to start to thank you for inviting me to this seminar. I will share my screen here with you. So you see the presentation there, right? Great. I will talk today on the topic Science Policy Relations for Transformative Change, how the social sciences may serve to open up deliberative space. And I would like to start in the concept of co-production of knowledge. The reason for this is that, as many of you know, there are different meanings attached to this concept. Co-production is sometimes used to talk about joint production of knowledge between, for example, policymakers, publics, businesses, the academia. And this is what I attempt to illustrate with this first picture here, where they are talking to each other. However, co-production also have another conceptual meaning or usage, and that is the definition of Sheila Jasanoff. According to her, co-production has a broader meaning and refers to the way in which knowledge also shapes the world that we live in and how we choose to live in it. So scientific knowledge is both embedded in and embeds social practices, identities, norms, discourses, and institutions. And science and technology has a key role when shaping and creating the world that we live in. And society is also mobilizing research to manage and develop society in different aspects, which then again shapes the context that we are living in, which the second picture here, or the right picture, intend to symbolize. So I will start from the broader definition then of Sheila Jasanow used, or that's where I start my arguments from. So, which I believe is also in line with the respects theory. So you see the books here, or a couple of the books that they have produced. So Ulrich Beck's theories on the world risk society, a society which is confronted with the unintended consequences of its own institutions, which seek technological solutions to manage these problems, which in turn may produce other unanticipated risks. In the world risk society, the anticipation of risk and the foreseeing of the future is central to knowledge and knowledge making. And how these however, these anticipations and forecasting practices also have performative effects and shape the way society develops. Yeah, and taking this position also means that co-production is seen as a condition of modern society. It also means that science policy interfaces are central features shaping societal development. Thus, if we want to understand how society can become more sustainable, we need to consider how science policy interfaces shapes and directs societal development, and how science policy interfaces could change to facilitate societal change and to open up broader sets of imaginaries of the sustainable futures. But so what would then science policy interfaces look like that are more productive for transformative change? And there are vivid discussions around this, and has been for a while, as Esther told. And central to these discussions, and specifically to those discussing global environmental assessments, is the need for broader inclusion, both for substantial reasons, to arrive at better understandings of issues, and for legitimacy, to gain acceptance for conclusions that are drawn. Another central aspect in these debates is the need for more solution-oriented assessment that goes beyond establishing the problem, to also discuss solutions. And the inclusion of social sciences is specifically discussed, either based on the argument that it is needed to assist implementation of solutions, but also, and maybe more importantly, since climate change and other environmental problems are socially produced, social sciences is needed to fully understand the problem, its causes, and the possible solutions to the problem. However, so far, the role of social sciences remains limited. So why is this? To approach this question, Rolf Lidskog and I made a study where we looked at the report that you see here, the IPCC's report on limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. We explored how we wanted to explore the epistemic constraints and the inclusion of social sciences in global environmental assessments. We wanted to identify how the epistemic infrastructure and culture building on Karin Knarr-Cetina shape what knowledge that is included and made central to the report and its conclusion, and what knowledge that is marginalized, even though it might be said or argued to be very important, even in the reports. So while we looked at this report, we think that it may have, the conclusions here may have broader precautions, or that it also is would count for other reports and GS. So what did we find? Firstly, the methodology of the report, the way it uses pathways and models serve to favor tangible solutions with a direct effect on CO2 emissions. And this means that more indirect, those structural interventions are disfavored in the report or through these methodologies, such as altering structural consumption patterns. To take one example for that, like diets, for example. Interventions where it is easier to calculate and thereby estimate CO2 reduction rates function better in these models, for example, technical solutions. So this means that such variables become central to this report. So this is an example of how the infrastructure of the report itself come to determine what is in focus or what is favored. And things that have a good fit are studies on innovation and land use, energy, technology. Certain forms of social scientific research fits the epistemic infrastructure as well. Mainly then, or most specifically, economic valuation and calculation. Another effect of the models is that current development trends are stabilized as they are being projected into the future. This has to do with the forecasting method where development lines are being stretched into the future. This also means that certain developments such as economic growth.
You are muted, Monica. Just in the last 2 seconds or so.
Oh, okay. What did you hear last? Did I start with like another effect of the models? Yeah, so I'll start from the second point here then. Another effect of the models is that current development trends are stabilized as they are being projected into the future. And this has to do with the forecasting method, where development lines are being stretched into the future. And this also means that certain developments, such as, for example, economic growth then are stabilized in these models or through these models, which has a performative function. Furthermore, the infrastructure shapes and constrains the scope of knowledge in the reports, leading, for example, to very reduced or general claims such as multi-level governance or deliberation is important. The knowledge and understanding of these processes within the social sciences is not reflected in the reports. And we argue that this has to do with a misfit with the epistemic infrastructure, which favors correlations. Thus, process-oriented research is not made justice in these reports, while it is critical for social transformation. And with process-oriented research, I mean research that attempt to create understanding of processes, interactions, or events, such as deliberation, exclusion, power, governance, or transformative processes. And to produce more profound or actionable insights, this knowledge needs to be tied to the context. Then it can strengthen the capacity to handle ongoing processes in a more reflexive manner. But this is not possible in these kind of reports. And regarding the epistemic culture, 2 ideals shape the assessment reports, and this relates to Esther's talk here. The consensus ideal. The focus is on where it is consensus or scientific consensus rather than where there is contestation, which may be equally relevant. I mean, contestation might be equally relevant and may point to burning issues. And also existing contestation is downplayed in these reports. And policy neutrality is another dominant norm which shape the way that different solutions and pathways are presented. Even though likely synergies, conflicts, and ethical concerns are stated or raised in the report, the report never really reaches any conclusions on or clear picture of the risk and benefits of each pathway, even though such judgments are begging to be made. And this has to do with the policy neutrality norm, or how that norm is being practiced. So what can this tell us? I believe that there's a need to also go beyond discussing global environmental assessments. There are structural reasons for why the benefit of the social sciences does not come through in these reports, even though it of course can be ameliorated in a different way or through different institutional changes. Particularly, it disfavors process-oriented research such that serves to increase our understanding of social and societal dynamics, which is essential to support the reflexivity of public and private actors. So what is needed is thus not technological fixes, but a broadening of perspectives and a vivid public debate. Green transformative change cannot only come from above, but need broad and diverse commitments in the public, private, and political sphere. And the role of science is then not to provide the solution to this, but to support and empower public reasoning by providing coherent arguments and conclusions based on transparent assumptions, and also in a diverse set of perspectives. And this may support public reasoning in all these spheres. However, to really do that, interaction as well as inclusion of multiple perspectives is needed. Wait, now what happened now?
We cannot see your slides anymore. I think you maybe stopped sharing.
It's so what do you see now?
Your last slide.
My last slide.
Yes, and now I can see your slide number 8.
Great. So time is running, but I'll be very short here and say that these kind of interactions, of course, also need to be institutionalized in some way. Rolf Lidskog and I have discussed in a previous piece how such interactions could be institutionalized, building on institutional arrangements suggested by Dreisek, Heyer, and Eckersley. We discussed what role that social science could play and what that means in terms of creating space for informed deliberation, inclusive of different perspectives, both on the global arena and in public organizations, for example, through reflexive institutions. And lastly, I just want to say shortly that I think that it is also relevant that we take a look at ourselves. So this is a mirror here. We are also embedded in, we social scientists, then I mean, when I say we're also embedded in and shaped by epistemic infrastructures and cultures, as well as governance arrangements. And this is something that I think deserves more discussion. To what extent are we caught by the ideal of pure science? Are our practices and priorities shaped by measurability or what is being measured, such as, for example, the production of certain forms of research or texts? What is our main role, or what do we consider our main role as social scientists? To write academic articles or to act as public intellectuals, and perhaps there's not one answer for all here, and we are caught in having to, of course, secure our employment. It's a pressure on researchers in that sense. And we were also caught, I guess, in the social acceleration and acceleration of productions of outputs. But to what extent are we as a profession complicit in distancing ourselves and strictly demarcating us from practice? Yeah, that is something that I think also deserves to be discussed. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Monica. I think these are very relevant points and worth of discussion later on. And now again, before moving to the third presentation, I would like to ask you to check this second poll we prepared for you. It will be on your screen just in a moment. So you should see now the second question. And again, just as the last time, please consider your own experience when you answer this question. You can select several options here, not just one. And Boldizsár, when you see that most of us filled the poll, just feel free to share the results.
Okay. People are still working, so I would wait a few seconds. So I will share it in a few seconds, please. I hope everyone could choose and vote. And now you can see the results.
All right. It's again quite interesting. Capacity building is the leading option, it seems, but very closely followed by providing more time and resources for cross-cultural skills and negotiation skills development. And then the disempowerment follows on. No, sorry, it's the train moderators, which is the third option, the third most preferred option. Thanks everyone for sharing your thoughts here. And again, if you have any questions or comments on Monica's presentation, please use the Slido link. There are already some questions. You can also vote for them or like them. So in this sense, you can highlight if there is another question which you would be also interested in to receive an answer or discussed. And now the floor is going to be given to Zsolt Molnár. Zsolt is a botanist and ethnoecologist, and he is working at the Center for Ecological Research in Hungary. And Zsolt also participated in the IBES Global Assessment and works really closely with local knowledge holders. So I think his perspectives will give us some more hints about how to go beyond the usual suspects of knowledge holders. Go ahead, Zsolt.
Thank you very much, Esther. I tried to share my slides, but everything is covered with the Zoom. Can you see it? Can you see my slides?
Yes, it's perfect.
Yeah, doesn't move.
It moves. It's now in the first slide.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. As Esther already told, I'm not a social scientist, but I use a lot of social science approaches and methods in my research, which is focusing on local and traditional ecological knowledge. And as discussed with Esther, I bring you some more field-based experiences, case study experiences, how inclusive research was done in our research group, and how it is connected to global assessments like EBS. So EBS, which is a crucial science policy platform for biodiversity at the moment, recognizes and respects the contribution of indigenous peoples and local communities' knowledge for sustainability and biodiversity. And at the same time, it acknowledges the challenges we face when we want to bring non-scientific knowledge into a science policy interface. Esther and Monica already mentioned some of these challenges. There are much more than listed on these slides, as you have seen before. I was an author in the Europe and Central Asia assessment, and the coordinating lead author in the global assessment. And my job was to bring in indigenous and local knowledge and the perspectives and values and perspectives of these communities, people into the assessment. So we faced these challenges in the last 4 or 5 years. And why a biologist is interested in local knowledge, traditional knowledge, because those landscapes we like or love and we want to protect are actually co-produced landscapes. And without understanding the locals' knowledge about the ecology of these landscapes, it's not easy to work with them and to work for them and work for the landscapes. So in the last 15 years, we worked in different landscapes in Central Europe and also in Asia, in Mongolia and Iran, to learn from people and to understand landscapes and landscape dynamics. So if you speak with locals, they are very diverse. Most of them has some sort of hybrid knowledge, combining local knowledge with school education, with knowledge coming from school education or internet and TV. There are still some people who are, we could call non-educated, which means that most of their knowledge, values and worldviews comes from transgenerational transmission from earlier generations, like this herder guy in Hungary. There are many people who have some sort of hybrid knowledge. For example, this herder likes reading ethnographic works and tries to understand his place in the world and tries to revive some practices that were described by 19th or 20th century ethnographers. And there are even younger and more modern farmers, herders, who use modern technology, whose worldview is more closer to our scientific or urban understanding. But on the other side, they have many worldview elements that go back deep into the past of that landscape. So working with these people, you meet very different values and worldviews. And working with them was really a challenge for me as a botanist, because previously I only stopped with these people in the field, say hello. We had some common food, some superficial discussions, but in the last 15 years, we are going deeper and deeper into understanding each other. And that's why we are doing co-production of knowledge about these landscapes we work in. This is one of the results or conclusions of the global assessment, the summary for policymakers, where we have made a big review on the contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities to biodiversity and its protection. And this figure and the legend to this figure summarizes these contributions. And how we did this, it was not only based on literature review of scientific literature, but we used a quite diverse approach how to bring in knowledge values, worldviews into this end results, or how you call it. So, for example, the previous slides showed this was mostly qualitative research because we focused on case studies and reviews, continental, regional reviews on what contributions locals have to biodiversity, but mostly analyzed the data in a narrative review and qualitatively. But we also did some quantitative work. For example, we looked for indicators of nature or change of nature that were developed by local communities and indigenous peoples. And we were able to find almost 1,500 indicators of nature, of biodiversity, what locals developed and used. And we made a quantitative analysis of these indicators. Hopefully will be published later this year or early next year. As I mentioned, there were lots of challenges during this work. That's why we felt it's necessary to write papers on the methodology we used and we tested and the experiences with these methodologies. One from the Indigenous and Local Knowledge Task Force and one with the authors of the global assessment of EBESS. So you can find useful information on how to do research that involves other knowledge systems and the holders of these knowledge systems. So what we did during the EBESS process, for example, we had dialogue workshops with the participation of the key authors of the assessment and traditional knowledge holders from the region or globally. This is an example from 2016 for the Europe and Central Asia assessment. And what happened after the workshop, we published a book with case studies on how indigenous peoples, local communities protect or help protect biodiversity. And on the lower picture photo on the left, you see a person, József Kiss, who is a traditional herder, who was so fascinated by this event at the UNESCO in Paris that when he went home, he interviewed his fellow herders and published a chapter in this book on how they contribute to managing and protecting biodiversity and ecosystem services. So this paper was solely written by traditional herders from Hungary. And this was cited in the assessment. So actually their knowledge became available for the assessment authors. And the chapter 2 on nature's contribution to people actually starts with a quote from one of the herders he interviewed during this process. After this dialogue workshop, we had local and regional dialogue workshops in Hungary and in Ukraine. In this way, perspectives and important issues for local people were brought onto the table and was brought into the EBESS discussions, not necessarily cited sentences, but these people bring topics important for them to the discussion of the authors, who were dominated by scientists and mostly natural scientists, of course. We also decided with the herders that we will show their knowledge in the form of films. On the left, you can see a film which was produced directly or deliberately for the IBES Central Asia, Europe and Central Asia assessment. We focused on questions, on key questions of the assessment, and 3 herders answered these questions. This is available online. And on the right, you see a newer film just released a month ago or some months ago. This is a 3 hours long film, an afternoon with a herder on the pasture. And the Hungarian version was ready about 1 year ago, and more than 500,000 people watched this film. So it's 3 hours long, a long discussion with the herder and me on what he's doing in the pasture. And I just calculated that 300 people watch the whole film every day. So in average, 300 people watch the whole film, which means that it seems to be an efficient way of sharing knowledge of those people who are not coming to conferences or assessment discussions, but these long films can give a chance for a scientist to understand why they think the way they think. The global assessment liaison group on indigenous and local knowledge visited this herder, and this was again another way to bring in his ideas and his perspective to the global assessment. So these informal ways were very important, because if you put these people into a meeting room in a modern building, they might be marginalized only by the surrounding situation and the methods we discuss problems in indoor. Parallel, we are doing lots of research on where we work together with local people. These are Serbian people, pig keepers in the forests of the Sava River, and we are looking for, because I'm an ecologist, so reliability and depth of knowledge and argumentation is very important for me. And that's why we are looking for people who are really observant, curious, good memory, and who can share examples that are really rich in ecological content. So we are not looking for the view of all the villagers in this area, but we are looking for specialists, in this case, herders of pigs. It's not easy to work with these people because their knowledge is tacit and they are not trained at sharing their knowledge with scientists. So we use diverse ways of iterative elicitation. And what we also did, we deliberately planned a research methodology that involves people, but also uses scientific, natural science methodologies and methods. For example, when we work with herders on the pastures or marshes, we also do parallel botanical surveys. So we have a knowledge, our own understanding of the pasture in detail. And then we go with these people for outdoor interviews in different settings. And then when it comes to paper writing or publishing, then we work together with the best people, with the most knowledgeable people, and sentence by sentence, we discuss the paper, whether they agree with the results and the conclusions or discussions of our paper. So they were not simply interviewed, but they also has an impact on what we conclude from the results, and even the wording of the sentences is discussed with them. If I have 1 or 2 more minutes, I don't know, Esther, how we are with the time.
Let's say 1.
Okay. Just one biological example, that people in the Carpathians use meadows, and they cut the hay in these meadows. They store the hay in barns, and then they are feeding with the animals with the hay. But what happens here, that something is falling out from this hay, and this is called hay seed. which consists of seeds, broken leaves, and dust. And locals actually collect this falling out material, they store it, and they spread it on the meadows. And 1 liter of this contains 12,000 viable seeds for more than 50 species. And as we already know, in all European countries we interviewed people, this method was used in the Alps, in Estonia, in Slovenia, and ecologists or vegetation historians were not aware of this. So thousands of people in the past used hay seeds to enrich their pastures, and this practice was reinvented by European scientists in the 80s and 90s. But for example, in protected areas, this is still not supported by European Union regulations. So with these people in the Carpathian, we work on to change European regulations to be more nature friendly, if possible. And last year we published a methodological paper in the Trends in Ecology and Evolution with my colleague Daniel Babai, how ecologists can work together with local people and can delve deeper into traditional ecological knowledge. Why is it needed for better ecology and nature conservation, and how actually you can do it. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Zsolt. And we have now roughly 15 minutes or a little bit more for a discussion. Just as a reminder, please use the Slido for your questions. And I'd like to ask Esther also to switch on your camera so that the participants can see the 3 panelists. Perfect. And also as a reminder, you can, the audience, you can also like the questions on Slido. So I will just select and read up from this list some questions to start or kick off the discussion. Okay, so there is one question which goes to all 3 of you, and it is like this. In light of all these challenges, do you think it is still worthy to conduct global assessments, or should science policy interfaces focus more regionally on concrete policy questions? So is it still worth to conduct global assessments, or are there other ways? And you can start in any order you wish.
Sure, I can say something perhaps to start. I'm actually a bit ambiguous about this. Because what I've seen, and this is something that might be quite, logical for you, but for me it was an eye-opener. That the fact that global assessments, that the recommendations are not taken up by national policymakers doesn't mean that they don't have an effect. And one example is the role of the IPCC reports in the court case that was started by the Dutch Friends of the Earth, and that was won against Shell. So I think in the global assessment, we have a statement in the summary for policymakers that continuing on the path of economic growth is incompatible with biodiversity or something like that. That also lots of governments have undersigned as a true statement, even the US. So I can just think I'm just waiting for the next court case to start, urging governments to abandon economic policies focused on GDP. So this is a route to impact, where it's where actually these assessments empower social movements. That is that I had a blind spot for, and that assessments could think a little bit more about how they can perhaps better empower social movements to hold their governments accountable through these reports. So then I think, well, perhaps, you know, it wasn't because before I kind of thought through that case, I would have said no without much reservations.
Thank you, Esther. Monica?
Yeah, I can say, I mean, I also think it is a good question, and a question that, I mean, comes up in your head now and then. And I mean, similar maybe to Esther, I also think that we don't know really. I think that it also keeps maybe the issue, attention to the issue, and it keeps it active on the agenda. It enables other actors to use it or to enforce their arguments. But definitely, I think there's a need to maybe consider how much resources that should go into them, what they should be targeting or focusing on. And also, I think that, of course, it also depends on different environmental issues, the most established ones that where we really need to maybe move forward, while the IPBES is still kind of all the time developing more. And yeah, there are smaller ones that are not as famous that can lift questions and have a greater impact.
Yeah, so my first question is I will ask back, what is a global assessment? So if an assessment is dominated by Western European, North American scientists, natural scientists, is it a global assessment?
Mm-hmm.
The focus is global, but the views and perspectives and experiences are not global. And I think IPBES made a big step towards more inclusive and really more global assessment by inviting people from other cultures and continents. But it's still a lot to go to really have an inclusive global assessment. So I would go for a global assessment, and I think it's important because even scientists are not, in their thinking, not global enough. Many scientists, we always see the globe from our culture, from our region. And these global assessments also contribute to the knowledge sharing between scientists. And I think that's important for a global understanding of the problems.
Thank you. I think that another question fits very well to this point. It was addressed to Esther, but I think it is again relevant to all three of you. Esther mentioned disempowerment in your presentation, and the question relates to this. So who should disempower dominant approaches? Or just going back to Zsolt's intervention right now, we could also say dominant knowledge forms or dominant actors. So who should disempower these dominant approaches, structures, and how to do it without risking the legitimacy of science?
Yeah, so I think that this is of course a very tricky question. It's very, I can only be quite personal about this probably. So I'm not bothered about the legitimacy of science, and I can afford to not be bothered by that. So I'm speaking from a very privileged position. I know this, and in my efforts to start having the conversation, Yeah, one of the things that has opened eyes before in conversations is to talk about the politics of neutrality. And how by being neutral just means that you accept dominance. And that for many is sort of an eye-opening insight. And then still the question is, how do you change that? Because fighting against dominance is political, while accepting dominance is neutral. That, of course, is a huge problem that I also face, which means that from a subaltern position, you cannot actually, equal speaking positions are not possible. But I also wonder what the risk is. Huh? So when people would push back against what I'm suggesting, saying this is really risky, I'm also thinking, yeah, but what are you talking about here? Who is afraid of what here? Are you afraid of your career? And sometimes my suspicion is you are afraid for your career. And then I still think that that's completely justified. But also as a scientific community, we should be able to move past that. We should be able to be a united front. But I think lots of academic systems have become so competitive, lots of infighting going on, that prevents actually building a collective movement because everybody has so much to lose. But it's quite ironic that it's the people in dominant power positions in scientific institutions that work on mainstream approaches that seemingly seem to be quite afraid of losing power and prestige. Well, I think, well, yeah, so my disappointment is actually with my colleagues, and in my experience is in lots of interdisciplinary settings, that for example in funding or grant committees, the truly interdisciplinary projects will be labeled as social sciencey and discarded. And it will be, so what will end up being granted in interdisciplinary calls for proposals is natural science dominated research proposals, which because the majority of reviewers comes from that school of thought, and they apparently cannot step over their own shadow and look at what would be the right thing to do. There's obviously exceptions, but we need to do it ourselves. All of us would need to be on board with this. And that's been my disappointment. It's within the scientific community that I get this resistance.
Thank you, Esther. Monica or Zsolt, would you like to jump in?
Yes. I agree with Esther. I do believe that my biggest scientific achievement in the last 20 years is this film. And I get 0 score for this achievement for this year scientific achievements. So 0 score for my belief. I believe that this is really something which is novel, which is deep scientifically, or at least not only scientifically, but transdisciplinary and crossing knowledge systems, and 0 score. So my answer to the question is these sort of things are changed during history by 2 factors: revolutions and catastrophes. I can imagine both, but without a revolution and without a catastrophe, vested interests are changing too little to really solve the problem. So I don't know what sort of revolution is needed, but I do believe in the young generation that they will stop us. In science, I don't think that things will change because of the vested interest. So no, a professor who has a career producing only high-ranked scientific papers will never accept that other scientific achievements are also relevant.
Yeah, I agree with both of you, and this was a little bit what I was with my last slide there, that we need to kind of look at each other or ourselves and change from within. And the who question is us. But I guess there are structures making it very difficult. But in relation to this risks of doing it, I think that these risks might be overestimated. I think that the legitimacy of science and research goes so much deeper than telling the truth or this imaginary of having the best answers or the true answers. It goes in the way that we build up the arguments. So if we are more transparent and can say that we can come to different conclusions depending on how we build up the argument, what we look at, what assumptions that we make, I don't think that necessarily need to delegitimate science and research, but it makes it possible to play a broader role, I think.
Thanks a lot. Our time is almost up. So I think that it's not really sufficient for another question to answer by all three of you. I'd like to, first of all, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts through these three presentations and also through this quick discussion after the presentations. And before going over to Juliet Young to close this webinar, I would like to ask the participants to please go back to your Slido screen, and we will launch there a very brief question, basically a question about what other topics would you be interested in for the next Alternet webinars. So if you have any ideas, any suggestions, any topics which are really exciting for you, then just feel free to type that in and share with us, and that will orientate us for the organization of the upcoming webinars. And now I just finish my talk and give the floor to Juliet. Juliet, please switch on your cameras and close the event.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Esther, for organizing this webinar today. For those who don't know me, my name is Juliet Young. I work at INRAE in France. And the hat that I'm wearing today is that together with my colleagues Alan Watt and Marie van der Waal, we work on the science policy interface dimension in Alternet on its management board. And these webinars are really key to this science policy dimension in order to really help our colleagues within Alternet institutes and beyond better understand SPIs, the challenges around them, etc., and also working together as a community on how to navigate and improve and revolutionize perhaps science policy interfaces as well. So these are really important webinars for us. So thank you again, Esther, for your organization of it. It really depends on institutions and individuals to get these webinars off the ground, so we really appreciate it. I adored all three presentations, so thank you very much to Esther, Monica and Jolt for your insights. I think for me, the webinar has been a bit of a step change from the previous ones, in that I think the last ones were focused quite a bit on challenges of SPIs, but without necessarily sort of reflecting deeper on our role as scientists in that science policy interface. And I felt today we really, the speakers and the discussions afterwards really pushed us to reflect further on it and actually maybe be braver as scientists in terms of taking a real stance, having a really strong role, and actually being less sort of neutral, less in the background, less shy in how we engage with science policy interfaces, but really, as Rod said, really try to revolutionize it. So maybe the older scientists among us feel that we haven't sort of left the younger generations with a particularly nice role to play, but I think we all have our role to play in this, and I really encourage more discussions on this. So also thank you very much for the participants for the questions. This is the only bit of these webinars that I find difficult, is that I really want the discussions to go on for longer. For us to have like a real, a real sort of to and fro and really challenge ourselves. But of course, we understand that people have busy lives. So thank you all for being here today and for taking part. As Esther said as well, this is part of a series of webinars. So we will have another webinar, hopefully in the autumn. Or maybe early autumn ideally, and I'll be in touch with some of the institutes that said they were going to help us organize one. All the webinars are on the website, as Maurice said, so please go and visit the website to see the other webinars. And if you have colleagues who think might be interested in this and weren't able to see it today, then please refer them to the website. And yes, I think we've got to the end of our time. So just thank you again to everyone, organizers, speakers, participants, and we really look forward to seeing you in the next webinar organized by Alternet. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot. Have a wonderful weekend.
Yes, you too. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for the organization. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Monica, for coming.